1993 and all that. The Soviet armies left Poland and Eastern Europe, and for once without a huge amount of bloodshed. It was the end of history, or so it seemed. How did that happen? That was in 1993, ancient history, and now it's 2025. Join me, Jan Darasz, for How We Got Here.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The Berlin Wall fell on November 9th, 1989. The signatures penned in Prague by representatives of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, and the Soviet Union put an end to the Warsaw Pact on July 1st, 1991. And the USSR was ultimately dissolved on December 26, 1991, after most of its constituent republics had declared independence. And yet, former Soviet, now Russian troops remained in the eastern part of unified Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states for many more months. Why? The Soviet Union used its largest contingent of about 380,000 troops, including heavy vehicles stationed in East Germany, as a bargaining chip in the negotiations over German reunification and European security guarantees. The sheer number of troops and 220,000 accompanying family members required Russia to build housing for their homecoming. But the economic crisis-swept state had to first secure massive financial aid from Germany. Poland called for an immediate withdrawal, but the Kremlin feared a rapid loss of influence against NATO's perceived rush eastward. Keeping troops in Poland gave Moscow a sense of buffer during lengthy negotiations, which also covered the fate of massive stockpiles of Russian weapons, bases, and facilities in Poland. In the Baltics, Russia played its favorite minority card, claiming it needed its troops to stay in Estonia and Latvia to protect the Russian-speaking populations. In reality, it used its forces to exert pressure on negotiations over minority rights, transit agreements, property rights, and the ownership of the massive Skrunda radar station in Latvia.
I'm delighted to welcome our guest today, Bartłomiej Kot. He's a foreign and security policy expert at the Aspen Institute and a regular guest and a great friend of our programme. Welcome.
Lovely to be here.
The 1993 seemed ancient history now, given 2025 and all that's happening. But as I was growing up, 1980s, 1990s, the Cold War seemed to be eternal. The Soviet presence in Eastern Europe, so we've got to remember it wasn't just Poland, it was East Germany. That seemed to be eternal, and it all seemed to collapse in a pack of cards. Can you outline the reason, like a pack of cards, can you outline for us the reason why? Why did it just seem to fold in a matter of a few years or so?
Actually, it is an eternal history when you compare it to where we are right now, but there is one similarity. In the early 90s, and as we are right now, there was this feeling that the European security architecture will change, and it's changing as we speak. And I guess we are in the very same times right now. We are rethinking what kind of the security architecture Europe would face as the outcome of the war in Ukraine, as the outcome of current Russian aggressive posture against eastern flank of NATO, or NATO as the whole alliance, given the recent engagements from the Russian side against Poland, against Romania and Estonia. When you look at the presence of Russian troops in the eastern part of Europe, that also includes, of course, the East Germany component. It was based on, I would say, a couple of principles. The first one, of course, if you even look at where they were stationing in Poland, that gives you a clue. They were mostly in the western part of Poland. Why? Because the doctrine from the USSR was simple. There would be a confrontation at some point with NATO, so these troops have to be ready to also invade and attack the western Germany.
So the battleground was somewhere in Denmark, Germany, perhaps Poland as a rear area.
The second thing, it was of course due to the domestic politics of these countries. So Russians, they were were aware of the fact that a lot of these countries are part of the Eastern Bloc, not because of their own choice, but because of the occupying forces that are stationed in these countries, and of course the support given from these forces to the communist parties present in these countries. So these forces were very often used, or at least used as a pretext as a threat against the populations of these countries. Let's take 1956 or 1968. So the invasions, the internal invasions, also happened in this country.
Fraternal help, I suppose, is
Indeed.
the technical term.
The Warsaw Pact was the only military pact that was successful only in invading its own members. And the third thing, especially in the Polish case, this is an extremely interesting thing, because we tend to overlook that. But both for Gomułka, so a leader of Polish Communist Party between 1956 and 1970, the presence of Soviet troops was also a kind of the backstop, I would say, against the revanchist politics of West Germany when it comes to the German eastern borders. So, especially in the Polish context, the lack of clarity, especially from the West Germany, but also East Germany for at least the very first part of the Polish communist state. It was necessary that the Russian troops were treated as a necessary tool to support the Polish rights to the western borders.
Yeah, so it was always something that they could, an ace in their cards to play, I suppose, in the 70s and 80s. What was the role? How did the Russians, or the Soviets, I suppose we must say more specifically, how did the Soviet forces behave in that period, early 1990s, before 1993, but after 1991? What did they continue training? Did they continue duties? They were in these enclaves, these hidden or secret cities. Did they just remain there and
if you look at if you look at the history of the presence of Soviet troops in the Eastern Bloc, in the Polish case, actually, the early phase between 1944 and 1956, it wasn't even legally. There was no legal basis for that. They were simply speaking, I would call them like occupying troops. It was only Gomułka in 1956 that he actually signed a deal with the USSR that gave like a legal pretext for Russians to be present, and this pretext was also a basis. The legal document was also a basis for support given to these troops by the Polish communist states. That also included, of course, provisions, food. And stuff like that, and because of this presence, Poland was also obliged to, of course, pay in a sense to the USSR for providing security to communist Poland back then. And it was also a time where a lot of even like small traffic accidents that happened with the presence of the Soviet troops, or people shot somewhere in the streets because of them being, simply speaking, drunk and not obliging to the rules, happened. It is estimated, if I'm not mistaken, that over 600 people, like throughout the presence of the Soviet troops in Poland, died because of these reasons alone. But as it evolved, especially, of course, 1956, then the military coup d'etat in Poland, there was also it was used as a tool to oppress the opposition in Poland, not directly because they weren't involved in any kind of the engagements, but still, politically speaking, mostly. But then the last part of the presence in Poland was very much connected to the politics, domestic politics in Poland, and also the changing posture of foreign policy of a country that changed its regime from the communist to the democratic state, and that also from the early beginnings had certain aspirations to join the Western political organizations. It was evolving. It had an evolving nature. Of course, the assumption that Poland would become the part of NATO was there somewhere, but there was like no clarity also from the American side. So it is very much linked also to the political changes both in Poland, in Germany, because of the reunification of Germany, the politics of Helmut Kohl versus the USSR, and the domestic politics in USSR/Russia. Because the negotiations that happened, for example, if you took Czechoslovakia, they were quite early in the game to negotiate with Soviet Union to withdraw troops from their territory. Poland was more hesitant, because for a long time, back into the discussion about the Polish western borders, the Mazowiecki government, so the first democratic government of Poland after the change of regime, wasn't that keen in engaging very early in the discussions with the USSR about the withdrawal of troops, mainly because of the lack of clarity about Polish western border, given the reunification time in Germany back then. Whereas at the same time, the government of the reunified Germany was negotiating with the government of the USSR about the withdrawal of the Soviet troops from their own territory, paying actually with a lot of money, because we tend to forget about it, but it was paid by the German money to withdraw these troops. Mostly because of the fact that one of the biggest problems that the Soviet Union had back then was what to do with 300,000 people once they are back in Soviet Russia.
We'll come on to the ramifications not only in Eastern Europe but also in Russia after our next clip, which will take us beyond 1993.
It's September 1993, and Polish President Lech Wałęsa receives a report from Russian General Leonid Kovalov on the completion of the withdrawal of Russian troops from Poland.
It's with great satisfaction that we note the withdrawal of the Russian Federation's combat troops from the Polish territories.
By September 18th, a total of 56,000 Russian soldiers and 7,500 civil servants had left Poland, taking along close to 600 tanks, over 900 armored personnel carriers, nearly 400 artillery guns and mortars, around 150 choppers, and a total of 443,000 tons of military equipment. What they left behind was around 70,000 hectares of military-purpose land, including 13 airfields. The infrastructure was later cleaned up and repurposed by the Polish army. Still, Russia's influence and presence in Poland remained. The Russian embassy in Warsaw remained the largest diplomatic facility in Poland. From September 1993, the Russian Federation continued using 11 properties in Poland free of charge, which were transferred to it under agreements between the People's Republic of Poland and the USSR. Some of the properties were used by Moscow without valid agreements or property rights, for which the municipal authorities in Warsaw and Gdańsk charged fees, calling on the Russian Federation to pay up. With no sign of compliance from Russia, Polish authorities moved in to seize some of those properties, especially in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. One of those properties, humorously called Szpiegowo, translated as Spyville, located in Warsaw, was reclaimed in April of 2022. In early May of 2023, a building rented by the Russian embassy to use as a school for their diplomats' children was seized under a 2016 Warsaw Regional Court ruling that also obliged Russia to pay over 7.2 million euros plus interest for the unlawful occupation of the property.
You talked about the legalities of the transition, troops moving out, negotiations, not just from Poland but from various states. Was this an important thing? I mean, we seem to have the image of, okay, the Russians should go and that's it. They just get on the train and leave. But there are lots of legal, financial treaties to be negotiated. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Indeed, because as I said, mostly the fact that for the USSR government back then, it was hugely problematic to allow around 300,000 Russian soldiers or Soviet soldiers back to their own territory without proper housing, for example. They treated that as a domestic political problem, what to do with these people. So a part of discussions during the negotiations with Russians was, of course, an issue how to basically speaking, how to pay for the withdrawal of troops. The German government was rich enough, let me put it that way, to directly pay Gorbachev government in Soviet Russia for the withdrawal of the troops, and therefore actually convincing them to be faster moving from East Germany. When it comes to Poland, as I said, in the early beginnings of the Mazowiecki government, the presence of the Soviet troops on the Polish territory were rather a complex story of foreign policy, not only against the Soviet Union, but also in discussions with our Western partners, especially with Germany. They were looking for stabilization of relations in Germany first, before asking Russians to leave or Soviets to leave. Then the biggest domestic problem that happened in the USSR was the Yanayev coup d'etat, which actually sped the whole discussion about withdrawal of the troops from Poland because of the change of government in Soviet Russia and soon to be Russian Federation. So all these domestic problems in the USSR that were a part of the Gorbachev government actually ceased to exist, and for Yeltsin it was easier to actually to get rid of these troops from the Polish territory, because he was also less pressed by especially the military circles in Soviet Russia back then. So they were discussing purely the financial aspect. And Poland was stressing one thing, that actually the state of this armed bases, of these areas that were occupied by Russian troops, was a lot of pollution. There was even ecologically speaking, a lot of destruction of immobilities there. So Poland stressed that they don't want to pay for the time that Russian troops were present. Neither they want to pay for, of course, the movement of the troops to Soviet Russia, or soon to be Russian Federation. And actually, Poland succeeded in pushing that through during the negotiations with Soviets, mainly because, as I said, of the domestic reasons that happened internally in Soviet Russia.
We talked before we came on air about the state of the German Empire in 1918, collapsing from within. The German army in the West didn't feel it was defeated; it had won in the East. Is that an analogy we can use for 1993? And what was the morale like of, say, the officer corps, the professional officer corps in the Red Army, Soviet Army? We know of what one KGB agent based in Leipzig thought about the whole period. Is it possible to gauge the effect that this strategic defeat, if we can call it that, had on the Red Army and its outlook, its doctrine?
Yeah, when you look, as I said, on the reasons why they were present there, first of all, there was a lack of confrontation anymore between NATO and Soviet Russia at this point, or Warsaw Pact at this point, because of the changes in the geopolitics. Secondly, the communist regimes in these countries ceased to exist. So these reasons were off the table at some point for Russians. So there was no point in being there present from the purely political point of view. And the third reason is, simply speaking, the Soviet Union, or soon to be Russian Federation, couldn't afford hosting these troops in these territories. So these were the reasons that actually, convinced the leaders of Soviet Union to withdraw these troops. Of course, it didn't happen without them trying to preserve certain strategic outlook. And you can see it quite clearly in the very first years of Yeltsin. So on one hand, he was admitting that Poland, for example, should become a part of NATO. He even signed a declaration, the Warsaw Declaration, once he was present in Warsaw. But then after a couple of, if I'm not mistaken, it was weeks, he sent a letter to the Western allies saying, completely reversing his point of view, mostly because of the internal influence that still happened back then from the military circles. So that was a changing element. Like in the early beginnings of Russian Federation or last moments of the Soviet Union, the military circles were still quite potent. In the Yeltsin era, they were limiting their influence over Yeltsin. At the same time, a new powers were emerging, such as mafia. That was basically speaking. They started from these links that the Soviet secret agencies had in the Eastern Bloc, and that were mostly actually fueled by the resentment by people who were trained to operate with guns, but they were right now left with no jobs.
Disgruntled.
Yes, and let me put that clear: when when Soviet troops were withdrawing from the Eastern Bloc, they started a robbery on extreme scale. That also included, of course, the cars being stolen from these countries and moved to Russia with the usage of actually military transport,
yes.
For example. So these were the beginnings of what I would call the mafia state that happened in Russia back then. When you look at the Soviet corps, because you asked about that in particular, the officer corps, it is also very much connected, in my opinion, to the ethnic diversity among the Soviet troops. Not a majority of the Red Army back then were actually Russians, the ethnic Russians. So if you look at the officers, I would say that most of them were Russians, and they either stayed or they relocated to Russian Federation or stayed in the newly formed Russian armed forces. Whereas NCOs, a lot of them being Ukrainians, for example, they joined the Ukrainian armed forces or left to Ukraine, and a lot of regular privates, coming from all the variety of republics in Soviet Russia, and therefore also once the Soviet Union was dissolved, losing a direct connection to or even a patriotic resentment, if it ever existed, by the way, to the state.
A great vacuum, if we can say it, was created by the Soviet evacuation of its troops, and there's a great debate. Did NATO move east, or did the former Soviet bloc move west? What's your take on it?
It wasn't an easy discussion at that point when the things were falling apart, because first of all, a lot of people were questioning whether NATO's existence is even necessary for new times. We all remember the discussions about end of history, Fukuyama's book, and stuff like
peace
that.
Dividends.
Yes,
as well, going to be.
But the truth is that the Central European countries, even at that point, understood that the Russian military presence in their countries, it is not something which is unfortunately uncommon. If you look at the current times we're living right now, the Soviet troops are not present in Poland for 31 years. It is the longest period since the first part of 18th century, where there is no Russian troops on the territory of neither Poland nor the Commonwealth. So it shows you how much a long history it is of the presence of these troops, their occupying aspect, their imperialistic aspect, and their burden on the societies of this region. So even back then, when things were falling apart like dominoes, the politicians of Central Europe knew that in order to secure their security, simply speaking, in the future, they would have to have or form a strong military alliance that would oppose the Russian imperialism in the future. So there was a political will, even back then, by the politicians of these countries, that they should be a part of NATO, if it's possible, or any other military alliance. There was an idea of NATO base at that point from Walesa, if that the West would not allow Poland and Czechoslovakia to enter, but it was always the thinking that there would have to be a military alliance that would oppose Russian imperialistic outlook in Central Eastern Europe.
Yes, the Russians, they always seem to be there. Bartłomiej Kot, thank you very much indeed for coming onto the programme. Great to have you. So that's all we have time for today. Join us next time when we'll be discussing the UN and its validity, status and its purpose. So that's Tuesdays, 21:35, 35 minutes past 9 CET. Join us then, don't be late.